Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be a recommendations video where I recommend different entry points into reading fantasy. So this video can work in a couple of different ways. So its intention is to help people who are not regular fantasy readers find books that could help them transition into reading fantasy. But because of the way that I'm going to set up these recommendations, I think if you like to read in multiple genres, then you might also find some fantasy recommendations that are good for you, even if you are a frequent fantasy reader. I see a lot of people do this video and just introduce books that they feel like would be good starter fantasy books for others to read. And I think that those videos are excellent. I just don't think that I have a lot to add in that capacity because so many people have done so many excellent videos of that nature. So I'm going to organize this a little bit differently. I have put together a recommendations list where I have chosen a bunch of different literary genres, everything from literary fiction to contemporary fiction to thrillers to mystery. And I've tried to pair the fantasy books with those genres so that you could find an entry point into fantasy that matches your particular reading tastes. Then at the end of the video, because I know this is also something that happens frequently, I made a couple of selections for people who were fantasy readers, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and are now just looking to get back into fantasy. So at the end, I have a couple of those as well, kind of re-entry points into fantasy, if you will. I do want to try to keep this brief, so we will just jump right into the recommendations. And the first literary genre that I want to tackle is literary fiction. So after fantasy, literary fiction is my favorite subgenre to read. I always really enjoy reading books of that nature. And I like it when I can find fantasy that challenges me or makes me think in the same way. So when I think of literary fiction, I think of character-driven narratives, I think of beautiful prose, I think of deep themes, I think of complex ideas that need to be explored. And a book for me that really stands out in the arena of fantasy that I think would make the perfect transition from literary fiction into reading fantasy is Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane. This is a book that explores childhood trauma. It explores how we change as we grow up. It has gorgeous writing and really lends itself to deep thinking. And something that is great about it is that it is a standalone novel and it is not very long. So I am trying to also keep that in mind while putting together this list, limiting it to either mostly standalones or books that could act as standalones and that are not huge chunky books that you need to get through. But I think if you enjoy literary fiction and you want to try to dip your toes into fantasy, rather than jumping straight into a heroic fantasy that has hundreds of characters and a ton of place names and a totally different prose style than you might be used to, I think that Neil Gaiman in general, but especially this book, would be an excellent place to start. The second genre that I want to talk about is science fiction. So science fiction fantasy is often lumped together. I have some ideas for a video talking about sci fantasy and where they blend and what books might fit into that little niche. But for today, I just want to recommend a book if you are someone who really enjoys reading sci-fi. And when I think of science fiction, the things that make me enjoy that genre are the complex ideas that are explored, the exploration of the impact of technology and scientific knowledge on the world around us, and ideas about how humanity may change or has changed over the course of history. So those are some of the kind of broader themes that draw me into sci-fi. And when I was thinking of a book that would, I think, hit those points, but also give you the fantasy flavor that you're craving, I thought of the book All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders, I believe is the author's name. This is a book that I think really toes that line between science fiction and fantasy. The setup is that you have childhood friends, Patricia and Lawrence. Patricia is a witch, Lawrence is a technological genius, and we follow them along their lifetime as they kind of come in and out of each other's lives, and how these opposing forces, Patricia's magic, which is very much tied to nature, and Lawrence's ability to manipulate technology and the impact that that has on the world, how they combine to give us a book that really, I think, explores what is great about both science fiction and fantasy. So if you read a lot of sci-fi, and you're looking to just integrate a little bit of magic into that to bring forth some of those themes and some of those ideas that are explored more frequently in fantasy, I think that this would make an excellent transition novel. It was a book that completely took me by surprise. I hadn't really heard a whole lot about it, and I ended up really enjoying it. So I think that that would make a good transition novel if you would like to start to get some experience reading fantasy. The third genre that I wanted to talk about is historical fiction. So historical fiction it's very difficult to come up with a recommendation for this because historical fiction encapsulates a lot of different ideas, a lot of different setups. There are obviously periods of time that are very popular in regards to historical fiction. There are a lot of books set around the Middle Ages, which we tend to think transitions into fantasy well because kind of our prototypical fantasy is that European medieval style world building. But people enjoy historical fiction for a range of reasons, and they're interested in a bunch of different cultures and time periods. So I actually gave 2 recommendations here so that you can maybe think about the type of historical fiction that you like to read and which book you think might fit with that. The first recommendation is more of a classic recommendation, and that is Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. This is your very quintessential European style setup. This is a retelling of the tale of the 7 swans, and we follow a young woman named Sorka who has to fight for her family after she is cursed alongside her brothers by an evil sorceress. So it's following Sorka's journey as she tries to defend her family and save her brothers. And I think that it balances the things that are really enjoyable about historical fiction, which is being transported into another time, feeling like you're living through another time period, getting to read about how people dress and how they act and how their relationships are different from the world that we live in right now. It is beautifully written and very compelling. So if you are looking for historical fantasy that feels like classic fantasy, then I would definitely recommend that you start there. Another great place to jump into reading fantasy if you enjoy historical fiction is R.F. Kuang's Poppy War series. So this is a series that follows a young woman named Rin who can utilize shamanistic magic, and it is about her journey in a world that is very dark, very bleak, and the battles that she has to face along the way. I'm trying to keep things very vague because I don't want to give any spoilers, but if you are interested in events such as the Sino-Japanese War, if you are interested in Chinese history, if you are interested in getting a look at a different cultural standpoint than we typically get in fantasy outside of that very European kind of medieval setup, The Poppy War is a phenomenal book. I would just warn you going in that it is very dark. R.F. Kuang has drawn from various historical actual historical battles, and some of the topics that are covered, some of the events that happen are very dark and can be very upsetting. So I would just be careful of that if you go into this story, but I think that it's a great entry point for people who really like historical fiction and want to experience some of what fantasy has to offer. I really enjoyed it. I think that Poppy War can be a little bit hit or miss because it is R.F. Kuang's debut novel, and for some people I think they find that the writing can be a little bit patchy, but I really enjoyed it, and I think if you like historical fiction that it would be a great place to start if you are just beginning on your fantasy journey. The next subgenre that I want to talk about is the thriller. So this is actually one of the very few literary subgenres that I don't read often because I find the things that I like about reading are harder to find in thrillers. When I think about thrillers, I think kind of less deep character exploration and more fast-paced, gripping plot, very digestible writing, and just pages that want you to keep moving. So this one was a little bit difficult for me, and I was trying to rack my brain and think of fantasy books that I feel like move along very quickly, but are also not super dense or the beginning of gigantic series. And the recommendation that I came up with is Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell. So this is the first book in the Great Coat series, and I do think that it integrates a couple of things that you can find in thrillers. I think that there is a background plot where there is kind of this background mystery that we're trying to solve. There is kind of a case that we're trying to get to the bottom of throughout the story. It is very, very fast-paced. The dialogue is snappy. When I think of thrillers, sometimes I think of books that could be adapted well to screen that would be very easy to watch. And I do get that sense from Traitor's Blade and from the Great Coat series overall. I think that these are characters that are really fun to follow. It is a fast-paced book that is so easy to shoot through. It is not too long, and I think the dialogue really keeps you engaged. So I think if you're used to that setup in a thriller where you can pick up a book and kind of flip through it as quickly as possible, and there's some central question that you're trying to get to the bottom of, I think that Traitor's Blade will give you some of those things, but also has a distinctly fantasy spin. We're given a little bit more character exploration than you would find in your typical thriller. And of course, this is the beginning of a series. So if you enjoy it, you have other books that you can go on and read. But as I don't read a lot of thrillers, this is something that I didn't know a whole lot about. So if you're a big thriller reader and you also happen to enjoy fantasy, please feel free to give some other recommendations down in the comments so that people could go down there and take a look through, because that is definitely an area that I do not have as much experience in. But moving along, the next category is one that I am pretty familiar with, and this is for people who enjoy reading romance. So romance is kind of my go-to palate cleanser. I love literary fiction. I love big chunky fantasy books. And then sometimes when I feel like my brain's like a little bit melted and I just want something cozy or something easy to flip through, something that is going to totally capture my attention, I reach for an adult romance, usually more along the rom-com side of things for me, but I do enjoy reading that every now and then. And I think that there are a lot of great books in the fantasy genre that prove a good transition point, but a couple that really stand out for me are The Song of Achilles, which is a retelling of the Trojan War. It's a retelling of the story of Achilles from the perspective of Patroclus, who in this book starts off as his childhood friend, and then they grow to form a much deeper, more romantic bond. And it's about their relationship, how the Achilles that we know through history and the Achilles that Patroclus sees through his eyes are very different people. And so we get a different perspective on Achilles as a person. We get a very different perspective on the war overall. And I think that it's just a very beautiful book. It is easy to read. The writing is beautiful and it kind of pulls you through. This is what I'm going to recommend if you're looking for a sad romance. If you know the story of Achilles, then you know what happens in this book. And it is heartbreaking to watch it unfold. On the flip side, if you also enjoy a good rom-com, you want to be able to laugh, to get lost in a romance that can sometimes teeter on the steamy side, then I would recommend Soulless by Gail Carriger. This is a steampunk-ish fantasy that follows a young woman named Alexia Terabati, and she has powers that make her able to render any supernatural beings harmless, essentially. So if she touches you, then you lose your supernatural powers, only while she is touching you, not forever. But there is a scandal in London at the beginning of the book, and Alexia kind of gets embroiled in this scandal and has to dig to the bottom of a mystery surrounding vampire society. And coming in to help her is Lord Mackin, who is the leader of a werewolf pack. And they have a very antagonistic relationship, and one has to wonder if there is some underlying romantic tension that is beneath all of this anger that they have towards each other. This is a really fun book. It has great dialogue. The relationship between the two main characters is phenomenal. From what I remember, it's been a while since I read it. I think it's a little bit steamy without the book kind of totally being caught up in that. And it's just a great time. I really, really enjoyed it. I think if you like romance and you want a fantasy book that feels a little bit like a rom-com, but you get those supernatural elements, then this is a fantastic place to start off. So I highly recommend it. I have a lot of fun reading those books. Coming up next, we have if you are a mystery reader. So if you enjoy reading pulpy detective novels, classic short mysteries a la Agatha Christie, I have to recommend Stormfront by Jim Butcher. So the Dresden Files is one of the most popular urban fantasy series that is ongoing right now. And in this series, we follow Harry Dresden, who is a wizard for hire. And in the first novel, Stormfront, we get to know Harry as the only wizard PI who is living in Chicago. And we follow him as he follows the clues along a case that someone brings to him in his business. And this has a lot of the things that people enjoy about those pulpy mystery classics. You've got your stereotypical PI type character. We have the members of the police force. We have the bad guys with whom you kind of have this begrudging antagonistic versus quasi friendship. Like a lot of the classic tropes that come from those pulpy detective novels that you can find in Stormfront. This is the first, like I said, the first novel in the Dresden Files series, but these are very much, if you think in terms of like TV shows, very monster of the week. Like there is an underlying character arc for Harry Dresden that evolves over the course of the series, but you can very much pick up this first book and stop at the end because it is a defined mystery. There is a central question that Harry is kind of chasing after, and that will be resolved by the end of the book. These are a lot of fun. Like I said, they come with a lot of those common tropes that come in pulpy detective novels. So if those are tropes that you don't enjoy, I don't necessarily think this is the best transition into fantasy. But if you enjoy those classic mystery novels, then I think that you would definitely have a lot of fun with Harry Dresden and with the Dresden Files in general. And the next one is another subcategory or another genre of literature that I really enjoy, and that is classics. So again, it can be hard to find a recommendation that is going to work for everyone because classics is a very open and vague kind of categorization. But what I was thinking about when I was putting this recommendation together was, when I think of classic literature, I think of stories that are able to stand the test of time. So with universal themes such as human relationships, how we relate to each other, concepts of humanity, beautiful writing, a plot that is going to feel fresh over time, and dialogue that can transport you to a different time period. So those are the kinds of things that I think of when I think of literary classics. And a fantasy book that I feel like would make the perfect transition over from someone who loves reading classics is Ellen Kushner's Swords Point. So Swords Point is described as a comedy of manners. And it is very, very, very low fantasy. So really the only fantastical elements in this book is that it takes place in a fictional universe, in a fictional town. But otherwise, it is very much a story of court intrigue, of interpersonal dynamics, of scheming and plotting. But it is also very focused on a handful of characters. So there's not a huge cast here. I would think of this more as like an Austen type setup where you follow a collection of characters amongst their daily lives and how their interactions and mishaps all kind of cascade from one another. The central plot follows a swordsman named Richard St. Vier, who is the most highly acclaimed swordsman for hire in the town. I believe the town's called Riverside. And he is hired to complete a job. And from there, you are just kind of sucked into this political, interpersonal mess. And Richard kind of has no time for that, but gets sucked in regardless. And if you enjoy that setup, that those interpersonal mishaps that often come up in classic literature, then I think you would really like this. The writing style is very reminiscent of older literature. It's just a lot of fun. At the time that I read it, it had been very unique compared to a lot of the other fantasy books that I had read. And I really think it's worth checking out, especially if you are a fan of the classics. It's a really, really good book. Next, we're kind of shifting gears a little bit, and I'm making this recommendation for people who enjoy graphic novels. So I know for a lot of young readers, graphic novels are a perfect entry point into reading. There are not as many words on the page. You get those beautiful, vibrant pictures to go along with it. Both my kids love, love, love reading graphic novels. And even if they don't want to sit down for longer books, they are happy to sit down with a comic book and kind of flip through and read that way. And I know for a lot of us, with life being very busy and finding it difficult to find the time to read, graphic novels can be a wonderful, wonderful way to get in that literary fix when you don't have huge pockets of time. The artwork is gorgeous. I really love graphic novels. The only downside is that it can be a very expensive hobby, or it can be a very expensive way to read, because with the gorgeous illustrations and the high production cost, you have to pay a lot for a book that is not going to last you a particularly long period of time. But that's not really the focus of this video. This is to recommend a book that I think will appeal to people who really enjoy graphic novels. So when I think of graphic novels, I think of obviously you enjoy the visual medium. You want to be able to visualize your stories. I feel like it should be a very vibrant, very imaginative book in order to make that transition really well. And the book that I have selected is called The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. So this is the only non-adult fantasy recommendation on this list. And for me, I think that middle grade fantasy, which is what this is a subcategory of fantasy that really encapsulates that imaginative, whimsical feel. I think a lot of people do not enjoy young adult fantasy because of the tropes and the character interactions and the relationships, which makes perfect sense. Adolescence is a very high angst time. It is a very highly anxiety-provoking time. It's a very highly emotional time, is what I'm trying to say. And so I think that there are very specific circumstances where you would like to read those types of books. I like to read those types of books, but I can understand if you do not. But conversely, I think that middle grade is much more accessible, much more universal. I think the themes and the types of book, or the types of ideas that are explored in middle grade fantasy is actually a lot more accessible than those that are explored in young adult fantasy. Because I think if you like that kind of soft, whimsical element of fantasy, there's a lot of classic middle grade or contemporary middle grade that feels like classic fantasy that I think will really work for you. And I do truly believe that this book, which is about a witch who lives in a swamp outside an area of land called the Protectorate, I believe that this would really appeal to lovers of graphic novels. In this book, this witch she has a reputation in town for eating babies, and so they have to sacrifice a baby to her. I don't remember if it's every year or every so many years. I think it's every so many years, like maybe 15 or something. And they sacrifice a baby to this witch, and unbeknownst to the townspeople, the witch actually has no idea why they're putting these babies out into the woods. And instead of eating them, she saves them. She feeds them starlight, and she brings them to another town where they can find loving families. But one day when she finds a baby, she accidentally feeds this baby Moonlight, and this gives the baby magical powers. So she names the baby Luna. She keeps the baby with her to raise as her own granddaughter. And it is a beautiful story about found family, about magic, about grief, about trauma, about fear. Fear is a huge theme in this book, and it is beautiful. I do not know how anybody could read this book and not enjoy it. I honestly did not think that there was a single bad thing about it. I don't say that often. There are not a lot of books where I feel like I can give my unequivocal recommendation, but this is definitely one of them. And I think if you enjoy graphic novels, this is a very visual, very imaginative book that gives me the same sense of almost whimsy that I get from reading graphic novels. So I think that this would be a fantastic place to start if you're trying to transition from reading mostly comics into reading more long form fantasy. So just read it. if I'm going to get you to read one book from this list, please read this book because I love it so, so much. But from there, I wanted to recommend a fantasy book to start off with if you enjoy reading horror. Now, again, I am not a horror reader, not because I don't enjoy it, because I think there are elements of horror that I really, really like, but I don't like being scared. And it takes a lot for me to kind of work up the courage to read scary books. So again, I don't have a ton of recommendations here, but I know that there are people watching my channel who do like horror and do like fantasy. So please leave some recommendations of your own in the comments. My recommendation, if you've been on the channel, is going to be very obvious. I think if you are a horror lover and you want to get into fantasy, a perfect place to start is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. The Gunslinger is kind of a horror, fantasy, Western mashup. The first book can act as a standalone. I think that it is a great entry point into fantasy for people who already enjoy that genre. It's a bit strange, so it's definitely not your typical fantasy book, but I still think that it is very much worth picking up. We follow a gunslinger named Roland as he marches across a desert in pursuit of someone called the Man in Black. And this is about Roland's trials as he tries to catch up to the Man in Black. And we also get some insight into who this kind of enigmatic character of Roland might be. This is the start of a longer fantasy series, which if you enjoy The Gunslinger, I would highly recommend you read, as it is one of my favorite fantasy series. But I think that this also would just make a good transitional book if you are coming from mostly reading horror and you want to transition into fantasy and kind of find some things that you like. So that is somewhere where I would recommend starting. And the last subgenre, or the last literary genre that I'm going to cover before I just give some general fantasy recommendations, is contemporary fiction. So the vaguest of all the literary genres, but contemporary fiction is just kind of the catch-all for something that you cannot put into another type of box. These are just your, I don't know what we even want to call them, your everyday stories, your regular books, the kinds of things that you might read at a book club, or the things that get recommended on the best of lists at the end of the year. They maybe don't explore themes that are as deep as literary fiction. The standards of writing may not be as high, but they are books that you can still get lost in, and books that really follow the plights of everyday people. So when I think of contemporary fiction, that is what I think of. I think of the everyday man, of just stories that encapsulate the human experience. And I think that a good transition, if you are mostly used to reading contemporary fiction and you want to get into fantasy, a book that I think would function really well is a book called Dragon's Bane by Barbara Hambly. So this is actually a work of classic fantasy. This was published in the 80s. But the setup of the book makes me feel like it would be a good transition from contemporary fiction. This is a novel that follows a man called John and his wife Jennifer. And John is the titular Dragon's Bane. So there's a young man from a well-to-do city who comes out in search of the Dragon's Bane. He is this man who has a reputation for slaying a dragon. And so he comes to find him because there has been a dragon that has infiltrated their city and they can't get rid of this dragon. So he wants the Dragon's Bane to come and rid the city of this dragon and for their people to be saved. And when this young man stumbles across the Dragon's Bane, he does not at all find what he is expecting. He finds an ordinary man and his wife, who is a practicing witch, and they are not at all what he is expecting. They are just ordinary people, and he is very let down by this idea of them. The idea that he had of them in his head and the people that they actually are very different from one another. But they still agree to go on a quest with this young man. They agree to go and try to help him to the best of their ability. And this is a very, it sounds like a very classic quest fantasy type setup, but what it actually ends up being is a very character focused and a very character driven novel. And it follows, unlike the title would suggest, it actually follows Jennifer, the wife of the Dragon's Bane, the witch. And it's mostly about her story, about how she feels about her life, about the sacrifices that she has made to try to maintain a family and practice magic at the same time. It is about regret. about the choices that we make in life. And that feeling of that exploration of regret and about what constitutes a life well lived is something that gets explored a lot in contemporary fiction. And I was really pleasantly surprised by this book. I was expecting just like a good old-fashioned 80s fantasy romp, and I actually got a much deeper character exploration than I was expecting. So I think if you like to read contemporary fiction, then this would be a fantastic place to start with fantasy. And it's just a really fun book. It will give you some of those classic fantasy tropes. You'll get some of those magical creatures and the magic use that you expect from fantasy, but also some really interesting character development and character exploration. So definitely recommend Dragon's Bane. And those are all of the literary genres that I want to cover, but I do get a lot of people who say that they come into BookTube and then they start reading fantasy after a long time away. So I wanted to throw in a couple of recommendations for people who are already used to fantasy conventions, who are already familiar with some fantasy tropes, and who are not intimidated by huge books. So I tried for this list to keep things limited to books that were not quite as long, that were mostly standalones, or at least beginnings of series that could function as standalones. But for these two recommendations, I'm going to recommend some chunkier books. And those are The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding and The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. So these are two book series. The Ember Blade is going to be a series. Book 1 is the only book that's out right now, but it does function quite well as a standalone. So I wouldn't hold off on reading it just because the rest of the books aren't out. I think you could very much read this book and stop there and be mostly satisfied. There's some dangling threads because it is going to be a series, but it has a very satisfying conclusion and is a fantastic book. The Faithful and the Fallen is a series of 4 books, 7 if you want to include the companion series, which was released afterward. And this is a multi-perspective fantasy tale that is built from classic fantasy tropes, built from classic fantasy ideas, such as the idea of a chosen one, the battle between good and evil, but definitely has some contemporary spin in terms of the character building, the character development, and how those particular tropes are handled. So these are 2 books that, to me, are very reminiscent of classic fantasy. If you read fantasy from the 70s and the 80s, and you're looking for something to get into that feels more contemporary in tone and writing style, but still has those very classic tropes that you love, I highly, highly recommend starting at either of these points. I loved the Faithful and the Fallen series. I loved the Ember Blade, and I'm very much looking forward to any other books that are going to be released in that series. So those are my recommendations. Those are my proposed entry points into fantasy. If you are watching and you have any specific recommendations for people, then please feel free to leave them in the comments. If you already love fantasy, but you also like reading some of these other subgenres or genres of fiction, please let me know how you feel about these recommendations and if I have convinced you to pick up any of these books. But I thank you for making it all the way through the video, and I will see you with another one soon. Bye!